And let me recall the previous occasion when we met to discuss this subject. It was actually on the 20th of June. And at that stage, the Higher Education Research Bill had just been the Lords and in its committee stage, and the Lords by that stage. House of Lords has devoted the best part of 60 hours of debate to this bill, and amendments are still being brought forward and still being discussed. There were 2 sessions this week which produced some very interesting decisions by the House to amend the bill in particular ways. Perhaps we'll come on to those aspects in the course of this discussion. And there'll be 2 more hours scheduled next week with the continuation of this discussion. So there still seems to be a lot to play for. And the campaigning will need to continue, I dare say. We have with us today 2 people who can help us understand the content of the bill, the effects it would have if it passes into law, and the broader political context in which the bill needs to be understood. And the first of our speakers is Andrew McGettigan. Many of you will have come across his book, The Great University Gamble, published in 2013. He's been very active in publication and blogging on issues that we're very much concerned with today. When I opened Andrew's book yesterday evening and read the preface, it struck me as uncanny how much of what he's saying there in 2010 is still highly relevant to what we're looking at now. His argument was that the government was taking a gamble with English higher education, but without presenting its plans or reasoning to the public. How familiar that is still. It intends to shift resources to the most selective universities while exposing the majority of higher education institutions to new commercial pressures. Direct funding is slashed, and formerly private providers will be nurtured into the sector, so undercut established provision. And he went on to point out that whereas there were developments going on in other areas of the public sector, reforms to health and primary and secondary education, as he wrote in 2010, the changes in higher education have yet to stabilise, and the promised bill has been delayed. Well, it's been 6 years. Andrew, bring us up to date.
Okay, thank you, David, and thank you everybody for turning out this lunchtime. I'm planning to maybe talk about the broader issue about what I would call a new settlement that the government seeks to establish for higher education in England. And I'm using that term particularly to echo what was discussed in 92-93 with the abolition of polytechnics and the abolition of Barney Divide. I think this is a new settlement to replace what was established in 93 and is as ambitious as that project. I'm not so much going to talk about the HE bill. I think what it might be better for me to do is to talk about the things that are already underway or already happening without the need for primary legislation. I understand Anne is going to talk about the Office for Students, and really one of the main tasks of the higher education bill is to establish the Office for Students. That does require primary legislation. But if you follow what HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, has been doing since November 2015, autumn 2015, a lot of measures have already been enacted in the sense of using regulations to change the way that body engages with the sector, and that's what I really want to talk about, because they give much more of a flavour about what's coming down the track, what the government's looking to put in place. So my main sort of overview for this is that the government as funder no longer believes in the generic value of the undergraduate degree. We're not anymore in the days of Tony Blair, when the target of 50% of people getting an undergraduate degree was desired for its own sake. Instead, there's now much less trust that the universities have upheld their side of the bargain. So we're at the end of a 20-year expansion and a liberalisation of funding, and Obviously, all controls on undergraduate recruitment have now come off since 2015. But at the same time, that's a relative largesse from the Treasury. And one of the things I'll be doing in this talk is ventriloquising on behalf of the government. So tends to be my way around getting through these things. But that largesse hasn't been. Universities haven't met the terms of the compact in the sense that they haven't delivered what the government expected to see delivered for that extra money. And that's really what I'm going to outline, because the new settlement is, in a certain sense, is about opening up undergraduate tuition to the scrutiny of the sector regulators and, more importantly, perhaps, the student as a customer. And really that's what I propose to sort of set out in the next 20 minutes, is how they're going about that already. So I'll be talking about standards, competition and information. I might say very little about competition. It might come up more in conversation afterwards. But really, it's going to be, what I would say is that the coming next decade is going to be a struggle over standards. So who controls standards and who polices standards, who has responsibility for standards, which traditionally has not been part of the regulatory or the funding body's remit. And a key point of struggle in the higher education bill, in the Lords in particular, has been the crossing out of the word standards when it's appeared, and the insistence that no, you can't go beyond quality. And the struggle over expanding the definition of quality to talk about standards, particularly the comparability of standards across the undergraduate degree, is going to be a key site of struggle for the next few years as the sector regulatory bodies moves into this area quite explicitly. And I'll talk a bit, if I have time at the end, I'll talk a bit more about information. The particular information provision I'm interested in is what's called LEO, the Longitudinal Earnings Outcomes Data, which is likely to be published in the next few months. But that plans to show graduate earnings broken down by subject and institution. So you'll be able to see what a Cambridge law graduate earns after 5 years and after 10 years compared to a De Montfort law graduate after 5 years and 10 years. And I've got some of the pilot data for that if people haven't seen it. It's a bit hard to show in this kind of format, but if I have time, I will show this, because I think this is really a key development. In some ways, maybe much more important than the Teaching Excellence Framework with its various coloured badges. In many ways, the undergraduates who do their own research will find this new earnings data published and will be able to make a different kind of decisions on the basis of it. And the broader, more political claim is that this is really a challenge for English HE, because all of our traditional understandings of institutional autonomy and academic freedom have been built around resisting direct political interference. And really the way that finance and accountability is going to work in the new regulatory schema means we have to be much more clued up about how to deal with indirect influence, particularly through information provision. Okay, so that's my kind of general overview, and really what I'm going to spend the talk doing is trying to flesh out this claim that the government doesn't trust universities anymore. So just for some background, here's the advent of our current mass higher education scheme. Up until the late 80s, 15% of the age cohort, at this point it's school leavers in that data, goes on to study at undergraduate level. And then we have this huge expansion in the 90s. I've only gone up as far as 2010 here, but this has creeped up a little bit further. And for women now, 55% of those under 30 go on to some form of undergraduate study. So this is a massive transformation, and one of the main examples of the funding largesse and the way in which is how this has happened. It's an enormous transformation, particularly for an advanced economy at such a relatively late stage. And the other thing that goes with this is obviously the funding. This chart is from the last week's publication by the Institute for Fiscal Studies on education spending. And the black line is the relative level of public spending, including grant and loan outlay, for a 3-year degree. And you can see that in 1990, when expansion begins, over the full 3 years, the institution is only getting about 18,000 per student, so 6,000 per year. By the time we get to 2012, that's pushing up to 9 or 10,000. So the universities were spared austerity because of the switch from direct teaching grants to institutions to loan-funded tuition fees. And this is really where the government is going to make its case. There are now no longer any recruitment caps on universities. You can recruit as many home EU students as you like. Obviously, EU is a separate matter. But for the time being, that's the case. And they're better funded than they were 20 years ago. It's an enormous amount of money going into the sector, The government funds the universities are expected to deliver on this. What was the rationale for this funding? Well, around about between 1990 and 2004, there was cross-party agreement that things like neo-endogenous growth theory held, that higher education was an important driver for the economy, important for increasing productivity of individuals, but also of the nation. And it's that, really, which is where the universities are to be tested if this level of funding is to continue. So this is the background. This is this is an enormous amount of money that's gone into the sector compared to 25 years ago. Right. So then we have to say, well, what's the new settlement going to look like? The key text, and if anyone's interested in the history of this, Milton Friedman's The Role of Government in Education is the text for the reform of English higher education over the last 10 years. And he's quite clear when he sets out that education is a form of investment in human capital, precisely analogous to investment in machinery, buildings, or other forms of non-human capital. Its function is to raise the economic productivity of the human being. If it does so, the individual is rewarded in a free enterprise society by receiving a higher return for his services. It's important to keep this quite in mind when we look then at the longitudinal earnings outcomes data, because if you believe we're in a free society where your wages reflect your increased productivity, then that data says something quite clear. That's an important thing to contest. The Higher Education White Paper echoes this. Increasing productivity will be the main driver of economic growth in years to come, and improving skills are the essential component of this. And in the accompanying TEF, technical consultation, the TEF will help to drive UK productivity by ensuring a better match of graduate skills with the needs of employers and the economy. So what's the problem? So there's basically a breakdown of trust which you can map across several areas. Firstly, degree inflation. What does it mean if 70% of graduates achieve a 2-1 or better, and 25% now get a first? Employers can't tell when they do their job application sift what the traditional 2-2-2-1 border means anymore. Graduates and non-graduate jobs. So we can think about the recent CIPR, Chartered Institute for Public Relations report into this, or other reports on this phenomenon. Earnings, the graduate premium, i.e. the return to your investment as an individual in the form of higher earnings over a lifetime compared to studying at university, that appears to be declining on recent studies. Complaints from employers about lack of skills, often anecdotal, but still it's part of this picture, particularly around literacy and numeracy. And it's telling that in January 2016, the OECD put out a report on England which basically said you've got too many people in higher education, not enough in further education. You've got a particular problem with literacy and numeracy skills amongst your university undergraduates. And the macroeconomy. There's probably people in the room who are better qualified to talk about this, but it's generally at the moment a bit of a crisis in the UK. What's gone wrong with our productivity? Why hasn't it returned to trend since 2008? And universities, in a certain sense, are going to get blamed for some of these, when you might argue that this is really not about what happens in undergraduate tutorial or in the lecture or the seminar room. This is much more about what's the shape of the graduate labour market and what role can universities play in it. But I'm going to leave this as the kind of setup of the problem. So here's Joe Johnson speaking in November 2015. And in November 2015, the rhetoric was much tougher. But I think it's important to see at that point what they were trying to do, because the rhetoric was much tougher, but it's also much clearer in a certain sense about what's desired. And one of the key differences between Joe Johnson and David Willetts is Joe Johnson doesn't really articulate very much what he's planning to do. Unlike David Willetts, who wanted to win the intellectual fight, Joe Johnson has decided it's much more strategically to his advantage not to say too much in public or to argue too much in public for these things. So this kind of covers all of the terrain I've outlined. Graduates from our universities are twice as likely to have weak basic skills, so that's the numeracy and literacy, and have not benefited from their investment as we would want. For these graduates, the returns to university qualifications are modest, with many not earning enough to reimburse their study loans. They are part of a bigger picture, which is that between 20% and almost 60%, this is the CIPD report I mentioned, of graduates aren't in graduate jobs. The average earnings premium, a crude proxy for the value added university in terms of enhanced productivity, is declining. It is negligible, non-existent, or even negative for significant numbers of graduates towards the bottom end of the earnings distribution. And they would therefore be better off not going to university because they never make up the earnings they lost by studying full-time for a certain number of years. Here's the green paper in 2015 on degree inflation. This is the kind of key bit here which I've emboldened. Over 70% of graduates now get a first or a 2-1, compared with 47% in the mid-90s. In 2013, over 50% of students were awarded a 2-1, suggesting that the grade band not only disguises considerable variation in attainment, but also permits some to coast. And this complacency was echoed recently, very recently, it only was published this morning. So Joe Johnson and Lord Younger sent a letter to the House of Lords on Monday where they quote Conor Ryan from the Sutton Trust in support of the Teaching Excellence Framework. We need to shake the university sector out of its complacency and open it up to transparency that has been alien to them for far too long. It is good that they are judged on impact in research and that the Teaching Excellence Framework will force them to think more about how they impart knowledge to those who are now paying £9,000 a year in fees. Just of interest, here is the data from the OECD. This is literacy and numeracy skills amongst university students. We are at the bottom of all these countries. So this is what justified them saying these students would be, many students would be better off in FE, not HE. And obviously the funding differentials between those mean that this is an argument the Treasury is interested in. Here's Edwina Curry. You remember her? This is her on Twitter on the 1st of February, mistakenly engaging with an economics professor, but saying, all those university degrees were supposed to improve productivity, but you chose media studies instead of maths, so you can't add up. And you know, there's often this complaints about Mickey Mouse degrees, but the kind of underlying kernel of this is about government as investor isn't seeing the right choices from students. So one, can we change the way students make their choices? This is where information provision is better. And can we change the way the institutions deliver on those choices by students by opening up standards to transparency? So this is my general claim about the loss of trust. Just to move on to government as investor, this is the latest figures from the OBR that came out with the Treasury documents on Wednesday. This is in billions, and this is for the UK, so it's slightly misleading, but loans to Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales are much smaller. This figure at the bottom is the contribution to the public sector net cash requirement of loans over and above the deficit. So if you think about the deficit and then you add these billions to the figure, this is what drives public sector national debt. And you can see this is a very large investment, increasing investment from the government over the next few years. And there's a very small footnote there. This dwarfs the potentially 12 billion in cash that the government hopes to raise from a student loan sale. It doesn't even cover 1 year of this shortfall. And in fact, the long-term projection on the contribution of student loans to public sector net debt as a percentage of GDP shows us that really the current loan scheme doesn't hit operational maturity until the 2040s. There's a large increase in public sector net debt from loans, which will become increasingly significant percentage of that figure, which is targeting the fiscal mandate, unless the government can sell these loans. So there's a pressure here from the investor, not just wants to see a return, it's also got a large investment to manage. Okay, and then we have this problem of moral hazard. I'll skip over these for the interest of time, but it's basically what I outlined at the beginning. There's no longer belief in the generic value of any degree. And I've put this at the bottom from Gary Becker's, I think it's from his book on the family. Children can default on the market debt contracted for them by working less energetically or by entering occupations with lower earnings and higher psychic income. As someone who teaches some of the times in the specialist art and design school, this is a very concerning statement that what we're wrangling with here is a measure that isn't going to be reflected in any of the TEF measures that I've seen so far, in some sense. So this is basically the problem. For all that investment, children are making the wrong choices. Children are making the wrong choices, they're entering the wrong occupations, they're doing the wrong degrees, and the universities aren't really making up that, or they're still offering subjects that maybe they shouldn't offer, or they're not teaching in a way that does, in fact, boost productivity. So I'll get now to standards, but I think this is, if you like, is the key bit. You're probably more familiar with the measures around competition, and I might talk a bit about the information, but it's how standards are already being opened up to a different level of scrutiny by non-academics. How this is different from quality assurance. Quality assurance was never about standards. It was about sort of processes and procedures and paperwork and things like this, to caricature it somewhat. And this was always the domain of the institutions and the academics. So here's discussion of the recent amendments to the HR bill. And really I've got this up because those of you who've been following the correspondence know that Universities UK and Guild HE wrote to the House of Lords a week before last, a week ago, saying that they were now happy with the higher education bill, and particularly because the issue over standards in the legislation was resolved to their satisfaction. They were worried, they were concerned that there was confusion about threshold standards, the standards that providers had to meet to enter the market, and that blurred the line with academic standards. I tend to think that the Universities UK and Guild HE have got this fundamentally wrong, because in some senses I'm not sure if they're paying attention or they're trying to play a very sophisticated, in their eyes, political game. But this isn't what's happening already. So this argument over standards, I think, has been misjudged in this correspondence, particularly on the what are called the sector bodies part. Here's the letter. We believe the bill as originally drafted was unclear about the difference between threshold standards and academic standards, what role the OFS should play in standards, and the vital importance that institutions retain the independence to define academic standards. This has been one of our most pressing concerns about the bill over the last 9 months, and we're most appreciative of the time peers spent dissecting and debating the question of standards during the committee stage. But they basically then say, thanks, but can you stand down now? We'd like the higher education bill to go through. But this independence is questionable. HEFCE has already reinterpreted the 1992 Further and Higher Education Act to conclude that it has responsibility for standards across the sector, particularly the comparability of standards between institutions and across degrees. It's decided that it has now reinterpreted it to mean that it has responsibility for standards. They set up a new standing committee for quality assessment in November, so 3 months ago, and that committee has the responsibility for ensuring the reliability of degree standards, including projects on developing training for external examiners, approaches to the calibration of standards, and a review of degree classification algorithms. So how you decide that a student has got a first, a 2-1, a 2-2, a third, etc. And I'll talk a bit, if I have time, about standards as outcome, as completion, jobs and earnings, because in some senses, standards as outcomes is really imposing what we might see in some senses as non-academic measured metrics onto the question of academic standards. Again, just the emboldened bit is key here. Again, this is the 2015 paper. Government says, we believe that the standard UK model of honours degree classification is on its own no longer capable of providing recognition hardworking students deserve and information employers require. This sort of underlines what HEFCE has been doing over the last 16 months. So, here's the different measures. The TEF submission. Institutions must outline how grade inflation is being combated, and they're encouraged to use grade point average for more differentiation between students. The new metrics in future TEF baskets include proportion of grads in highly skilled employment, and by 2020 it will incorporate graduate earnings, the longitudinal earnings outcome. But these will already be published, some of it will be published this year, and they'll be incorporated into the new destination of leaders for higher education. This information will already be published as well as being incorporated into the TEF. There's going to be an external examiner's review. So in 2015, HEFCE, HEA, a higher education agency. Sorry?
I think it's Higher Education Academy.
Academy, yes, that's right. It decided that the external examiners is not currently fit for purpose, and it's particularly not fit for purpose around the key function of ensuring comparability of standards across subjects and institutions. They recommended training for external examiners and some kind of measures to calibrate standards, like examiners coming together across subjects and within subjects to decide where the standards lie in the sector. There'll be a review of degree classification algorithms, and the new DELI will include what's called graduate voice measures, which means that after 15 months after graduation, graduates will be asked about, in regards to their current activity, whether they have a sense of meaningfulness and importance in their work, are they utilising what they learned at university, and how are they oriented towards their future goals. finally, learning gain, which is a whole different subject in itself, which there are several pilots on this. Maybe this will come up in questions. And the one thing that I think is worth talking about, particularly now that Michael Barber is going to be the chair of the Office of Students, is the review of UCAS tariffs. So the key issue about controlling public finances is controlling loan access. And in a certain sense, you wouldn't be interfering with universities to do what was proposed in the Brown Review, which I'll show in the next slide, to control which students got places at universities, which students could have loans to fund their place at universities. So this is a quote that used to be in the back drawer because this was one of the Brown Review recommendations that wasn't implemented. And just for those of you who aren't clear, Michael Barber was on the Brown Committee, and it's generally accepted that he wrote a lot of the Brown Review on Lord Brown's behalf. But they proposed, rather than creating a new test of aptitude, which the government looked into between 2005 and 2010, a standalone university entrance exam, our proposal builds on UCAS tariff admissions, which is currently used by 70% of full-time undergraduates. There would be a minimum entry tariff that will be set by government shortly after the UCAS deadline for receiving publications, and you'd have to meet that entry tariff in order to get loans to study. These things, I think, are now pretty much on the table, particularly because this is the kind of thing where you could get someone like Pearson to proctor any other supplementary tests that you desired around loan access. And again, it's not traditional direct interference in university admissions, but it's basically interference in who gets funded to study, which currently, if you have a place, you get the funding. So I think that's the best point for me to stop and hand over, to outline that this is where the focus of policy and regulation is going to be over the next few years, regardless of whether the higher education bill gets through or not. And it's a difficult one for academics because they have no real sense of how to conduct these struggles. But also because, in a certain sense, management would also like to open up standards so they can see what's going on in the classroom and in the boarding. And in many institutions, they already do in many ways. But you can see that there would be a commonality of interest of institutions, management and government to open up what's traditionally been the preserve of academic judgment to a different kind of scrutiny. So I think that's the point where I'll stop. If people want to ask about information provision in questions, I will be happy to provide that.
I'm going to be, in a way, a bit more narrowly focused. I mean, Andrew's given us a very broad, pretty rather depressing overview of the future. But of course, what is immediately going on, as has been mentioned, is this higher education research bill, which is currently being very closely scrutinised by the House of Lords, to such an extent that I had some time on Wednesday afternoon, so I prepared what I was going to say, but yesterday I was desperately checking Hansard, hoping that there had been significant amendments, but also hoping that actually nothing had happened which was going to mess up what I was going to say. But I think not, but there's a kind of health warning that I may already be out of date. Okay, so what I thought I would focus on particularly was the role of this new Office for Students which is being set up. And my perspective on that, I don't have Andrew's detailed knowledge of the sort of broad education environment, but my perspective on that is as somebody who has been a member of staff representative on the council of Royal Holloway, which is Royal Holloway has an academic board which is like a senate, and then it has a council which some institutions call a court, so it kind of oversees things. And in that capacity, I did get interested for my sins in the way universities are governed. I got involved in a revision of the statutes that was taking place and so on. So I kind of think I have some view about this. All right. I also actually found very helpful the publications by Martin Wolf, which David alluded to, one of which arose from a lecture, the annual lecture that he gave for the Council for Defence of British Universities. Very interesting to have somebody who has an economist view of this. And so I think it was really Martin Wolf which made me see very clearly what I've got on the beginning of this slide, I want to talk about the role of the OFS, the Office for Students, as a regulator. And again, this goes along with some of what Andrew was saying. The government sees higher education as a market, right? So there's this picture that education is all about improving your productivity, and it's a market. They talk about universities as providers. They talk about students as consumers. I think we're all now familiar with the language. But of course, what happens if you have a market and you believe in a free market and all of that, but then if you have a completely free market, funny things are going to happen. I mean, for example, if you really open up the university system in this country as a completely free market, well, Cambridge and Oxford are probably going to charge very high fees because, you know, the current fees do not cover the full cost of the very individualised system that Oxford and Cambridge operate. Other universities are going to charge quite high fees. Some institutions are going to charge lower fees. Students aren't necessarily going to be able to afford to go to where they'd like to go. It's all going to get a bit out of hand. So what do? You bring in a regulator. And this is comparable to what has happened with various other parts of the economy. So, you know, we have Ofcom in charge of telecommunications, we have Ofwat looking after the water industry, we have Ofgas dealing with the gas industry, and so on. The interesting parallel, I think, perhaps because I just know a tiny bit about it, is what's happened with the telecoms market. So when BT were privatised, you know, BT had a monopoly. There was a view that's a bad thing. Well, perhaps it was a bad thing. Perhaps they'd got a bit too big, a bit uncompetitive. They were privatised, and lots of other providers came in, some of whom are no longer around providing telecoms, companies like Mercury that you don't hear about now. So you had to have a regulator. You had to have Ofcom. And what does Ofcom do? Well, one of the things that Ofcom does is it keeps BT in check. It's trying to make space for smaller providers. So I think that this is fundamentally, as I see it, this seems to be the way that the government is thinking of the role of the OFS. It's going to regulate the higher education market. There is clearly a desire to open things up, let in private providers. Okay, so what do regulators do? Well, they keep a check on the price. What's the price in higher education? Okay, students are the consumers, the price is the student fees. And this, I think, is the fundamental reason why in the bill the plan was that the TEF, the Teaching Excellence Framework, was going to offer a way of regulating those fees. As I'm sure you're all aware, there are going to be these gold, silver and bronze medals, whatever, for institutions, and then, you know, what fee an institution could charge would go with the standard they reach in the TEF. Okay, that for the moment was thrown into question again. As many of you will know, on Monday this week the House of Lords passed an amendment which basically cut the link between the fees and the TEF. Now, of course, that may not go through. The bill will go to and fro between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. It may be that in the end the Parliament Act will be invoked and that amendment won't go through. But I think this is quite significant, actually, that that particular part of the OFS's role is now in question. But the OFS isn't just doing that. I mean, one of the serious concerns that I and other people in the CPDU have about the OFS is the fact that it's being given a number of different roles which conflict. And you can see this particularly, I think, in the second thing I want to talk about, which is that the OFS is being set up to replace both HEFCE, both the Funding Council, and the QAA, the Quality Assurance Agency. Okay, so HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, is a funding council, but of course the trouble is it's now lost a lot of its role as a funding council. It's still distributing research money. It was, and perhaps it still is, distributing a little bit of teaching money for STEM subjects. I'm not completely up to date on that. But again, as we all know, teaching is now largely funded by student fees. So HEFCE's kind of lost some of its job, but there's other things that it does. So it oversees the finances of universities. It makes sure that universities all have to report to HEFCE about, they have to submit a version of their accounts, They're required to have a certain percentage of surplus in order to cushion them against financial shocks. And the other thing HEFCE does is it does oversee the regulatory framework under which degree awarding powers and university title are granted. Now this is where things get a bit complicated. If you want to set up a new institution, if you're a private company and you want to set up something that you're going to call a university, you have to go, there's two things you have to do. You have to go first to the QAA, who I'll talk about in a minute, and then ultimately things have to be approved by HEFCE. Okay, so what about the QAA, the Quality Assurance Agency? This is not really, I think, the favourite body of most people in universities. I mean, one of the reactions that I had when in the CDBU we started going into this and talking about how the OFS were going to take on some of the role of the QAA, I have to say one of my reactions was, well, you know, not that fond of the QAA, maybe you could do with replacing. But then, of course, it turns out the alternative is in various ways rather worse. Okay, so what does the QAA do? Well, what I put up on the slide is actually, the language is taken there from the QAA's own description of what it does. It monitors and advises on standards and quality in higher education. And I'll come to what that means in practice at the moment in a minute. But the crucial thing is what's in italics there, that the QAA is independent of HEFCE. Whereas if we have a body, if we have the OFS taking on both the roles of HEFCE and the roles of the QAA, then that independence disappears. Okay, what does the QAA do at the moment? Well, how does it deal with standards, use that word, academic standards? The main thing it does is subject benchmarking. So, I mean, there was a period around about, somebody was asking when it was, and I couldn't quite remember, but around about 2000, I think, when there was something called TQA, Teaching Quality Assessment, and there was a kind of inspection system which was operating for universities, was incredibly heavy on paperwork. It did actually involve people coming round from another institution, coming watch you teach, so okay, I didn't have a problem with that aspect of it, but that was terribly expensive, terribly bureaucratic, so that went out of the window, and subject benchmarking came in. So again, I have to say that in my own subject, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about what are the subject benchmarks for classics and philosophy, my own two academic areas, but those benchmarks do exist. They're supposed to be what people look to when they're setting up degree programs. The QA also does audit institutions, and that's very much looking at processes and systems. And then the idea is that universities do conduct their own internal reviews of teaching. So in my institution, we have something called periodic departmental review. I assume there's something similar in Cambridge. And basically, if you satisfy the QAA that if your institution satisfies the QAA that it's conducting those reviews satisfactorily, then they tick the box, they leave you alone. So this is a relatively light touch. I mean, it is still some kind of overview, but it's a relatively light touch. So the proposal, essentially, is that the OFS would take over all these roles. And as I say, the concern is that the body which deals with quality assurance, if indeed that's what it's going to be called, maybe become a body dealing with standards, would no longer be independent of the funding body, no longer be independent of the body that's setting up the regulatory framework. Again, there's a difference at the moment between HEFCE setting up the regulatory framework and the QAA as dealing with the details. So again, if you want to set up a new university institution at the moment, I think I'm right in saying this, you talk first to the QAA and then ultimately to HEFCE, but those two bodies are distinct. And the intention to merge them in the OFS is, I think, rather worrying. Okay, so then we come to the third aspect of the OFS's role. This kind of follows on from what I've been saying, I think. So the way that the politicians talk, put it like that, and I've used the inverted commas because it's really not language that comes naturally to me, is they talk about the OFS as controlling entry to the market and the exit from it. Okay, so the view is, higher education is a market, here we all are, can't resist saying this. Here we all are, like the Socrates in 5th century Athens, offering things for sale. Yep, offering stuff for sale. Claiming to teach people how to be successful. So here we all are doing that. Well, that wasn't regulated, okay. So the OFS are sort of controlling entry to this market and exit from it. And one of the questions, and I put it as a question because, again, this is very much something which is under debate in the House of Lords right now, or literally not today, but was on Wednesday and will be again next week, is how easy should it be for a private provider to acquire degree awarding powers and university title. So essentially the higher education bill as drafted was wanting to make it quite a bit easier, be a shorter period of time, I think it was 3 years instead of 4 years, for an institution to be running and offering its qualifications, and in other ways it was going to be made easier to acquire degree awarding powers and then university title than it is at the moment. If I've got this right, David Mitchell has probably more got the details of this in his head better than I have, but if I've got this right, there was an amendment passed on Wednesday of this week in the House of Lords which goes back and says, no, it's got to be 4 years, and again, there are other amendments which have yet to be discussed, I think, which would make it a bit harder. So you can see, however it goes, you can see what the argument is about. The argument is about how easy is it going to be to enter the market. Now, of course, there is a point of view which says, oh, well, there's Joe Johnson's thing about people, current universities being like people running a club with bouncers outside, and we're not letting people into the club. He likes that analogy. He also likes the one about the hamburger joints. So, you know, as if you're running Byron's Hamburgers and you don't want a cheap hamburger joint to open up round the corner. Okay, well, I don't think that universities are either really that much like a club. Yeah, they are a bit, but nothing quite the way he says, and I certainly don't think that what we're doing is the equivalent of selling hamburgers. So, you know, the idea that we're somehow there, universities are somehow there objecting on principle to other people competing with them is, I think, mistaken. But that is the view, and so there's a kind of battle going on about the answer to the question on the slide, about how easy it should be for a private provider to acquire degree awarding powers. Okay, that's the entry to the market bit. What about the exit bit? Again, there are various different aspects of this. The thing that I thought I would draw attention to is that at the moment, as well as the roles of HEFCE and the QAA that I talked about, the Privy Council also has a role. So the current position is that universities that were established before 1992 need permission from the Privy Council to change their statutes. I think the ex-polytechnics, the institutions that became universities in 1992, they have a different legal status. They're higher education corporations. And I know that their status is different. I'm afraid I can't tell you exactly what it is, but I have, I think, a little bit of understanding of the status of the pre-1992 universities. Okay, most pre-1992 universities have their own charters. There are a few, like my own institution, that are set up by Act of Parliament. And one of the things which has caused considerable concern about the Higher Education Research Bill as originally drafted in its current form, perhaps I should say its original form, is that it would in fact remove the role of the Privy Council. So if you wanted to change your statutes, you would go to the Office for Students, not to the Privy Council. Well, you might say, okay, which either way, it's really a bunch of civil servants. Maybe that doesn't matter. I think it matters. I think it matters because, again, you're ending up with one body. You're ending up with the Office for Students, which is doing what HEFCE does, it's doing what the QAA does, it's doing things that have previously been done by the Privy Council. So that's that. And then another aspect of the current bill, or the original form of the bill, is that it would actually give the Secretary of State the right to revoke a royal charter. So, in principle, the Secretary of State could turn around and say, well, Cambridge isn't doing too well these days, don't like jobs their graduates are going into, we'll take their royal charter away. So there's been a lot of criticism of that, and again, this is very much under discussion. the subject of amendment. If I've got this right, some of the amendments which the government is now wanting to make to the bill include watering this down. And they're saying, oh, well, we didn't really mean that. And there's an amendment, I think, which says, no, you wouldn't revoke the Royal Charter in its entirety. So there's a bit of pulling back going on. I'm sorry?
You could revoke the degree awarding powers or the university title.
Yes,
but not
right.
the Royal Charter itself.
Right, okay.
So they would amend the Royal Charter.
Yes, okay,
That's
so
what
they'd
it
amend
is.
the Royal Charter. All right, so thank you. So there's a bit of pulling back going on, but I think that doesn't change the basic point that I wanted to make, which is really, again, about the OFS, that it is being given a great deal of power. Okay, those powers, interestingly, in the discussion that's been taking place over the bill and the amendments, those powers are being curbed to some degree. But again, I think there's quite a large political and constitutional question, I suppose, about, there's the issue about whether the government can interfere in universities directly or indirectly. Andrew was pointing out that indirect interferences, I suppose, have been going on for a long time, but it's probably increasing. But there's also an issue about, if you have a government body which is overseeing your public higher education system, what kind of shape should it have? Should you actually have more than one body? Should you have a body that's dealing with standards, quality assurance, whatever, which is separate from the funding body, precisely to avoid conflicts of interest? And I think I think there is a real cause for concern that the OFS is being given too many powers and is going to end up having to balance out too many different interests. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Do you have questions or comments, either directed at one of the speakers or on any issues that you find a particular concern in relation to the things we're discussing?
I suppose this is a question to all three of you. Looking at the state of the debate in the Lords over the bill at the moment, how do you think, or how successful do you think the response has been to the bill in pushing the Lords in a certain direction, shaping how the Commons have responded to this? And I mean both from the position of, say, the trade unions, UCU primarily, and from universities as a sort of collective body. Do you think they've been very successful in pushing the government in a particular direction with the bill or not?
I have some thoughts of my own on that, but let me ask Anne first of all, what are your impressions?
I think there has been a certain measure of success. I think that one of the problems is that the bodies that you would think would represent the sector, like UUK, Andrew's put some of the stuff in their letter to the Laws up on one of his slides, they are not necessarily pushing in the same direction as, I have to say, the rest of us, a lot of the people on the ground. So that's been difficult, but I think there has been quite a measure of success, but I think we need to keep it up. But yeah, it's interesting how it's gone, because in terms of trying to put pressure on when the bill was in the Commons, I think plenty of attempts going on there to do that. CED was trying to do that. We didn't seem to be getting anywhere. It's very interesting that I think there's been a lot more success with the House of Lords, which contains a number of individuals who are really they're very well informed, and they've also been very willing to listen. But I think we need to keep at it.
Andrew?
I wouldn't present myself as someone who really understands the ins and outs of the parliamentary process in enough detail to know quite where we are. But I would also say we shouldn't ignore here the lobbying efforts of the National Union of Students, or UCU. UCU in this. I think the problem has been that it's quite clear that Joe Johnson has been marshalling various people from offer from the Sutton Trust and representatives of University UK and Guild HE to sort of say there is sector support now for the bill. And I think this is the general tendency is to confuse senior management representatives from institutions as the sector. And my own sense is that they want to keep as much money as they think there is on the table, and are prepared to go along with the TEF because they think they'll be able to steer it in certain directions, for example. But the key issue, which perhaps hasn't been made clear here, is that TEF's going on anyway. In Joe Johnson's letter that was published this morning, he says it's already in train, it's already underway. It doesn't need primary legislation. What they need primary legislation for is to link the outcomes of the Teaching Excellence Framework to, firstly, a differential maximum fee cap. So at the moment you can set a maximum fee cap for publicly funded institutions. What you can't do is set different ones for different institutions, and the TEF is designed to do that. That needs primary legislation. The amendment on Monday broke that link. If you break that link, it means what's the incentive then for universities to participate in this voluntary activity? They won't see their inflationary fee increase on their maximum fee. So it's a tiny bit of the bill, but it's absolutely crucial in some sense. But the TEF will go ahead anyway. And there are lots of institutions debated whether to enter this second round of the TEF. So I know that LSE governors met in January to decide whether they would participate or not, and decided in the end to participate because they felt it's better to be inside the tent, have input into the process, particularly with the idea of subject-specific teaching excellence framework coming down the track in 2020, when they think they'll probably do, they'll be in a position to do quite well on this score. So I'm at the moment, I fully expect those amendments to go back to the House of Commons and each one to be voted on and rejected by the Commons, and then it will come back to the Lords. So the issue is now about time. When does the legislative season end? I don't see Simon in the room. I'm pretty certain you'll know this better than me. But they've got to get this done before Easter, otherwise we go back to square one. And the other thing that's obviously going through the Lords at the moment is the Brexit bill. So almost in a certain sense, the best case scenario is that the Lords send it back, engage in enough ping pong to run out of time. Otherwise, if anything is passed, it will be passed pretty much in the form without these amendments we've discussed, because it's not in the interests of the Conservative Party to pass it with these amendments that the Lords have put in place. In a sense, they are wrecking amendments. The original question was how successful have the sector bodies been. They have a very particular agenda, which is protect income, and in a certain sense, they'd be very unhappy with the Lords because it's very easy for government to be quite embittered about this. And I think Lord Younger said in the speech on Monday, in the debate, that, well, you're basically giving up £16 billion over the next decade. How happy are you about that? So that's a discussion you have to accept, because despite the unpopularity of the current fee and funding regime, it does mean the sector's been spared austerity. We haven't had to make the job cuts and the cuts to cuts to provision that you've seen in local authorities and further education, and that's it's a powerful argument that has to be taken on board. So what's the outcome you want from the lobbying? Basically, is the kind of the question back from that.
Indeed, I agree with everything that Andrew's been saying there. I could just amplify one of the points that Anne made. The experience of lobbying Parliament on this one has been that you're working in a very different situation in the Commons than in the Lords. The most obvious factor affecting that situation is sheer numbers. If you look at the record of the committee stage in the Commons, every argument that the opposition side could run was simply being voted down when it came to it. Nothing moved. In the Lords, you not only got a different balance of numbers, but a very significantly differently informed collection of people. And I think Anne and I have both been very impressed by the quality of debate we've had in the Lords over specific dimensions of the bill and the impact they would have on what we like to think of as higher education. And Andrew, yes, wrecking amendments they might be, but they definitely are buying time, and we agree. I think that's extremely important.
I think it may be, I mean, perhaps this is just because I'm a natural optimist. I take your point entirely about buying time, and that may be what will happen in the end, if we'll just run out of time. But I think the amendments have given the opportunity for the arguments for a different way of looking at things to get out there into the public domain. So you might hope that the things that have been said in debates and the Lords won't just disappear. They won't just get completely swept away in whatever the next wave of legislation or whatever is going to be. But that may be over-optimistic.
Other questions? Yes.
What's the point of giving the Secretary of State the right to shut down universities? Is that like so that they can, or is it just to give them power over them, or is it like what's the point?
Well, there's an old saying in chess that the threat is stronger than the execution. But the real problem is a lot of you'll see often people say we desperately need a new regulatory framework because we've already got lots of new private providers in the system. They can access loans and they can already access grants, which I think people aren't aware of. They've been able to access grants since September 2015. But there's no proper regulatory powers. In particular, the Office for Students will be given the power to enter premises without notice. Whereas at the moment, I did a lot of work for The Guardian on the Cashpoint College's story. Key issue there was that the Business and Innovation Skills, QAA, HEFCE, none of them had the power to enter any of these private providers that were accessing student loans. They had to give them, I think, 4 weeks' notice, by which time, things could be changed quite radically. And I know of institutions where they replaced every computer in the building, and there also were rumours that I had. This is being recorded, isn't it? Ask me about that afterwards. But let's say there was an interesting industry in mobile libraries. Qualify that. We'll talk a bit more about that afterwards. So the real issue about the revoking powers, it's revoking degree awarding powers and revoking university title. People have received those in a number of different ways. I mean, importantly, Oxford and Cambridge aren't in this at all because they don't have a criminal charter, they're too old, they're older than the state. But other institutions have, as part of their Royal Charter, have degree awarding powers and university title. As part of that, other people have gained those degree awarding powers and the university title through different processes, particularly private providers who might be university colleges or have only just become universities, etc. The important point is to give someone the power to undo those decisions, because at the moment, if you've got the degree awarding powers before 2004, you have them in perpetuity. You can also see it as, we're shedding a feudal remnant by taking the Privy Council out of this. In a certain sense, it's a bourgeois market reform. So have a market regulator rather than some bizarre committee that has an awful lot of weird functions that remain. So the question isn't so much that they think there are particular universities that they're worried about. Again, that's another conversation perhaps to have off camera. But they've let a whole load of people into the system. There are lots of people with university titles that didn't have them 5 years ago. There are lots of institutions which have degree awarding powers that didn't have them 10 years ago. And there isn't any real way to manage that process. So the issue here is to give, the Privy Council, it's not clear if the Privy Council has the power to revoke anything at the moment. The key thing is to put some kind of regulatory sanction into the system for severe malpractice, and it will be used as a last resort, but at the moment nobody has that power. And it's much more about the new private providers that are already accessing public funding than it is about established universities. But it needs to be a level playing field, so you have to have the powers to deal with everybody fairly. Again, though Oxford and Cambridge are not in this.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, thanks both for the really very useful, interesting talks. Andrew, you are saying that there's a new settlement that's as big as what happened in 1992, and then it seems to be driven primarily by this breakdown in trust. And you mentioned 5 elements of that. And when I look at the list, only one of those seems to actually be in the obvious control of universities to fix, which is degree inflation. And there's a second that is a little bit in the control of universities, which is orienting, improving skills. But a lot of people feel that addressing that issue would change the nature of universities, move it away from basic research and towards just job training. So you also said something very interesting at the end about how you don't think that academics know how to fight these struggles. Is there a chance of reframing what universities are being saddled with in terms of resurrecting high productivity, high paying jobs in an economy that we don't control, so that we're not actually held responsible for this? In other words, that there could be a renewal of trust on the basis of what universities actually are.
What if we showed enough willing? No, I think that's a really important point, because I mean the reason I showed the Milton Friedman is I think that's a really important aspect of human capital theory to grasp. The fundamental belief that in a free market economy you're rewarded for your higher productivity in the form of higher earnings. So the corollary is that higher earnings are a sign of higher productivity, and then you go back to higher education. The reason we fund it so well is because it's meant to develop these higher level skills which are meant to boost productivity in a different way. It's meant to be a different, qualitatively different kind of training. But so we want, they want to see the evidence of it. But it's quite clear. I mean, I'm quite tempted to show a graph here, but we're going to probably take too much time. The question is then, what can universities do to improve their positioning in these kind of measures? Well, firstly, they can change what subjects they teach. One of the things I could show you is the difference between art and design graduate earnings and economics earnings and law earnings. You can change your student intake. If I showed you the institutions whose graduates are doing very well, and you ran it, you'd ask how many of those law students are going into city jobs, that would probably be the best way of explaining the outcome. It's not the case. Maybe I will show you this, because I think it's worth seeing, because too few people have seen it. So it's a horrible spreadsheet, so it might not be visible from the back. Yeah. I want can people see this? This might be, I'm warning you, may not be visible from the back. This is the pilot data from what's called the longitudinal earnings outcome. And legislation was changed in 2015 to allow the payroll data on which it's based to be used to develop these performance tables for universities. And the pilot data was published in December. And what I'm going to show you is law graduates from 2008, 5 years after graduation, by institution. I'm probably going to have to narrate it to you because it's such a huge spreadsheet. It's very difficult to read or see. Along the y-axis, that's earnings, so it goes from 5,000 to 80,000. Along the bottom is each individual institution that has law graduates, and the green is the upper quartile earnings, red is median, blue is lower quartile. And if I go all the way over to here, here's Oxford, here's Cambridge. I have to kind of stretch to show you where their law graduates are after 5 years. So, I'm talking about 55, 60,000 as the median earning here. And then you've got an upper quartile, so there's another 25% above the upper quartile. And you go all the way along. So we have a course here at the University of East London where 25 students of their law graduates are earning under 10,000 5 years after graduation. And the median here is 20,000. We're going to get this for every subject in every institution in spring, so sometime between now and May. This will be published. The idea is that universities will publish this as part of their key information set, so you'll have to put this on your website. Graduates from this course earn this much at 5 years, this much at 10 years. And then it will be, in a few years' time, it will move into the TEF. Now you can see, if you believe in human capital theory, in a kind of very naive sense, these universities are doing a fantastic job. Look at how productive their graduates are. Look how much they're rewarded for their higher skills. But we're not going to push it that far, are we? Because we don't believe that if we created another London School of Economics, we would replicate this performance. And my bet on this, and this again is the raw data put out with no narrative by the government, is that what we're seeing here is not that a lot of people here are not going into becoming becoming barristers and solicitors. Those of you who are barristers and solicitors know this is not what the earnings after 5 years after graduation look like. These are people going into city jobs, and we're talking about market capture of opportunities. So the economy does not look like the government imagines it. So this is, you know, this is Chris's response. How much can anybody here be held accountable for this? You know, I mean, okay, you might want to say, well, what is going on here? There's something we want to know what's going on here, but this isn't. There's no regression analysis here. There's no allowance for the input. There's nothing. We don't know what students have got qualifications. And then, in some sense, the government is keen on this kind of thing because they think it will attack misplaced prestige. That would be my interpretation of this. What's much more interesting about this data is not what's happening over here, but where the rest of the Russell Group are. If I look along the middle, this is Liverpool, for example, not in the top 24. The other thing is this: the reason the government is kind of a bit coy about this is not going to run in alliance with the TEF narrative. There are bronze institutions here, and I won't stay on record, but there are gold institutions down here. And that means you're sending mixed messages to the public. I mean, effectively, the TEF is meant to be an alternative price signal because tuition fees are not a price. So you're getting you've got a huge problem here. This information, you know, in some sense, isn't this what an awful lot of your students want to know about courses, and particularly comparing, which, you know, should I do economics or law, for example, or should I do? I'm not really interested in law, but I'm much more interested in philosophy. I can show you. I mean, philosophy is my background as well. I can show you the subject data for philosophy. It's not very good compared to economics and law. But you know, we don't have any experience of managing this. And you know, in the first instance, it's just publishing this information. That's the key move, to nudge students to make different choices. We can't really complain about this, can we? What would our argument be without looking like the complacent vested interest who is finally having what they do in the classroom opened up to a different kind of scrutiny? This is a really powerful move. So then, you know, what we can kind of, in response to Chris's question, we can try and engage with this. But how do we do that? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I sit in a certain sense outside of this. I do a bit of teaching and I do freelance writing. I'm not someone who can take the position of an academic in a certain sense. But, you know, some institutions are very, very happy about this. I mean, University of Surrey, very, very happy about this. Birkbeck, very happy about this. When I put this on Twitter, the guy who runs the law department at Durham, hooray for Durham. And it's like, well, yeah, hooray, you're mostly attracting very well-off men into your course. You know, that's not how you're going to present this to the public. So, okay, I mean, I come across as a pessimist, but I have no idea how you deal with this. We have no sectoral experience to draw on, Chris.
Well, from a business point of view, you're just judging a sector by something it doesn't produce, which is salaries. So it's just, you know, it's like judging corporations by their charity outputs as opposed to by their, you know, profit and loss.
But you're also loaning all these students £50,000 to £60,000 a year. So you're the government as investor. Damn right, I'm going to judge it on that basis because that's the best. This is absolutely the best. It indicates how much money I'm going to get back from those people. Should I be loaning? You know, every time, if you look at the departmental accounts, business innovation skills, every year they complain there's no credit check, that they have to give loans to people who have degree places. You know, the message is, whoa, you know, you can really develop a narrative around deadbeat students. Are these the students who are privileging psychic income over hard work and paying off their investment?
Yeah.
You know, I'm ventriloquistic, obviously, I'm adopting a highly ironic term, but the question then is, you can make these arguments, but then the real question is, you don't fund them at £9,000 a year because it's not clear that they're getting the benefit that you thought it was. You'd fund them at FE level because FE you're only funding at £4,000 to £5,000 a year. You can get loans now, you know, for FE. Why would you be lending these students £60,000?
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize, but you basically have two choices. You can do what we've done in the States, which is eliminate the income threshold and force everybody to pay it back and disallow bankruptcy and completely, you know, change people's lives if they can't get a job. That's what we do.
Yeah.
The other choice is to do what I thought you were calling for when you said that we didn't know how to struggle, which is a reframing, in which we say, do you want mass access to higher education or not? And if you do want mass access, you want two things. You want to constantly increase quality. So the goal here is to move everybody up all the time, but not measured by salaries, but measured by learning, because that's the thing that we actually do, learning and research. And then you figure out if you actually want to eliminate some of the providers and thereby reduce access. I think the answer to that would finally, in a democratic society that's trying to upgrade its skills to compete globally, the answer to that would be no. I mean, if you really push it back on the government, you would force them to say, okay, you're setting up a bunch of metrics which make most of our sector crap, and therefore suggest that these students shouldn't go to those universities shouldn't exist. So therefore, you're just going to shrink, like you want to go back to 15% or 20%. I mean, I think the government's position could be pushed to its logical conclusion, which is that you have an elite higher education system, and then you have a very large population that doesn't actually get into it or gets into a clearly subprime version, like our for-profits, and you've essentially done a downward spiral from the, and the Conservative Party would be responsible for this, of your educational attainment in your whole country. I mean, that's where I see this going. Just not looking at it just from our point of view, I see that where it's going for the society is England being less well educated than it was 30 years ago or 20 years ago. Because you problematize 80% or 90% of your institutions.
But the context for this is degree apprenticeships, technical education, and further education, alternative tertiary education, not higher education. The argument is these people shouldn't be at university. They shouldn't be doing university degrees.
Right.
They should be doing something else.
Right.
And
that's
so
what I'm saying takes England out of what the Tories say they want, which is global competitiveness. By lowering standards.
Unless you buy what was in the budget, which was a budget all about technical skills and reforming technical education. Anyway, I'm going back and forth between us two.
Yes.
When did public spending on higher education first start to be thought about in terms of investment in individual students? Like, when do you see that in terms of salary learning or not? But it's clear that this is based also on the idea that it's at the level of the individual student and that it is an investment, that higher education is not expenditure. But there's an expectation of some kind of return, that return is located
in the UK? Or?
Yeah, is that always been discussed?
Well, I mean, the human capital theory is historically relatively recent, right? And it's Friedman and Becker. Friedman's earlier work with Kuznets on the returns to professional training, which I think is from the late 1930s, early 1940s. But it doesn't. I think it really doesn't begin to be the main way of thinking about higher education funding until that phase of expansion from the 80s onwards. I mean, the key thing about neo-endogenous growth theory is that education is a key factor in growth, and it's buying into that. And I wouldn't underestimate it. I think there was a general consensus, Treasury, political parties in the 90s, that we were lagging behind. 15% was kind of laughable compared to the US. And if you go back and read things like Robert Reich, and the whole idea that we were going to, in the knowledge economy, we were going to have head nations who were going to do the critical symbolic manipulation, and there would be body nations who were going to do the manufacturing, and we had to become a head nation, so we had to send students. I mean, I think that's what I would say is it's those key things all coming together in and around late 80s, early 90s that are really important. But I'm sure there are historians of economics and economic policy who might be able to give a better answer on that.
What did it replace?
I think that's then when it then links into the idea that students should be paying fees, that you're not funding teaching by giving the institution a grant to teach. It's surely linked into that as well.
There's a very interesting TV program from the early 90s, I forget its name, which was about which economic segments of society receive the most public subsidy, and I think it was Julian Legrand who fronted it, and basically they present higher education is like the biggest middle class earner going, because that 15% is, because it's basically a huge state subsidised for middle classes. I mean, I think it's a prime time TV programme on this. So, I think in some sense that's the kind of point in which these things come into the public consciousness.
There's a hand over there.
Yeah. First, thanks for the talk. I like very much. I learned a lot about this human capital theory to understand the evolution. But my question is about a general feeling of frustration I have had for years working here. Is what can we do? We, meaning UCU. I mean, what can we do against that? I know it's hard. I'm not asking for magical solution, but at least to try to collectively think about what we can do against that, because it seems to me we are very much reduced to a study group commenting the evolutions. We can, and it's good because we are academics, so we love to understand things. That's nice to gather and understand, realize that we understand better what has happened. And it's very frustrating. I feel we are reduced to commenting the debates within institutions. Yeah, the House of Lords is probably a bit less awful because we are not exactly constrained by the same electoral agenda, well, for obvious reasons. So yeah, that's true. They'll probably discuss it differently, but it won't change the global evolution, which goes back to the fees in many ways. Well, there are things before that, but the key aspect is the fees in the 90s, mid-late 90s, which has actually very little democratic legitimacy. It was never in any political program of any party. And so not only it's wrong morally, socially, but it's also not very legitimate democratically. So again, I don't have a magical solution, but I would dream about serious campaigning. Of course, we won't change things in a day, but at least to campaign against this evolution, even if it's just an ideological fight for the moment, free education, something that would basically make all this marketing Friedmanian construct completely irrelevant. Because if you remove this question of fees, you remove basically all the need to reform the education system as a market. Regulation, return on investment, all these things that just cease to be.
It's astonishing how far we've moved in 20 years, I think, on this question, and just how difficult it then is to undo it. Although there was no democratic legitimacy in terms of electorate, there was an astonishing level of agreement across political parties. I mean, and there tended to be this move of commissioning a review and then agreeing that no one would comment on it, on the review, until after the relevant general election. So you had Deering in '97 and you had Brown in 2010. Almost an agreement to take the whole question of higher education funding out of the general election. I think the only thing on it that was in everyone's manifesto in 2010 is we're going to sell the student loan book, which everyone did put in their manifesto. And this, I think the ideological concepts are really important, because I think these really went through all the major funding institutions, the major arms of government, the civil service, the treasury, and the political parties. Income contingent repayment loans were seen as a silver bullet that avoided the problems of graduate debt in the USA. And you find an outline of them in the 1955 Friedman paper. So I think it's hard to underscore how many people bought into income contingent repayment loans. It's basically spared the sector austerity, so almost management's in favour of it. It's it spared us austerity. It's lifted the rationing on university places, and which is, if you want to do the intergenerational line, I mean that's the historical injustice of the 1980s, is how few people who were qualified to the university went. So that's lifted. You've got a mass, not a universal system. So how fair is it to charge everyone who might not use it directly? And there's a subsidy still there in the loan, so you've still got public funding, and it looks like a fairer mix. It mimics a progressive graduate repayment tax in its distribution. There's still a subsidy there, which looks like the subsidy that should public goods that come from the thing. I can't stress how much that's the key to this. So when you talk about fees, we can't not talk about income contingent repayment loans. In a certain sense, that's the real problem. That's why people are so casual about how much debt students are in. You know, in some senses, the real crisis is around the full-time degree is the cost of living for students studying full-time, which no one will talk about. So I don't know. Maybe I'm not doing anything other than adding something to your comments. I mean, Corbyn's Labour Party wants to abolish tuition fees, but what they'll put in its place is not clear. There isn't really any solution. We have the most expensive model of the boarding school model, students going away from home for 3 years. You know, if anything, it would be good to turn back the clock. And I always remember it's one of the David Lodge novels. I think it's Nice Work, where he says, it's the annual migration of well-heeled youth. We've got the wrong model to start with. That would be my thing. I think the 3-year full-time degree is a problem. I think part-time. There's only the real progressive solution is part-time, but whispering now. So,
but can I just rebut on that? Why is there no solution to removing this tuition?
It's the expense. It's 20
billion
billion.
in this country. It's still done in many countries. It has nothing to do with boarding school. I don't see really why we connect the two things.
Because
free education funded by. I mean, macroeconomically, the money has to come from somewhere. If it comes from the state budget, it's just socially more equal than distributing the money through a complicated and quite costly system for the society of collecting fees locally with a system of loan afterwards. I mean, money always comes from somewhere. It's just when it comes from the budget of the state, collected through taxes, with a certain level of social equity, or connected through this market process and this army of managers there to manage this thing. So I don't see really what is impossible in this. It's the opposite. We should even if our capital is difficult, we should ask what is the most costly in terms of bureaucracy and organization.
I think as far as the boarding school model goes, I mean, I actually think that's already, as you call it, I think that's already shifting. I mean, it may not be so evident in Cambridge, I guess, but I was talking about sort of a colleague in my institution the other day. We are undoubtedly, I think, having more students who are living at home, not so many students who are coming living on campus, having, if you like, a boarding school type experience. So I think there is a bit of a shift going on there for financial reasons. As to what you can do, well, I mean, I suppose the problem is you have to try and combine doing something while, not having too many illusions that you're going to change the world overnight. So, actively through organisations like UCU, CDBU, I do think that sometimes there are opportunities to make some difference in your own institution by getting involved with its governing body, etc. Again, exactly how that would work in Cambridge, I'm not sure. I don't have enough knowledge of the governance of Cambridge. But, I mean, I think if you just kind of say, well, we can't do anything, then you won't make any progress. It's like when people say if you don't apply for something, you won't be considered. So, you can do something to kind of, I don't know, hold up the tide or something. And I suppose just by, why am I sitting here? By sort of getting up and being prepared to challenge the model. Sorry, yes.
We can take one more question, I think, but we expect to be out of the room too.
Thanks very much. It's just I wanted to be interested in any comments on a suggestion I've heard that in view of the bill and blah, 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 that the University of Cambridge might become independent, be another University of Buckingham, and I would be interested in your comments on that as a way of avoiding all the regulations that come with the bill.
I can turn the camera off.
If you turn off camera, I can say a bit more. But I think the key thing is currently there's the financial memorandum, and you sign a single financial memorandum as an institution which gives you access to public funding. That's high-cost subjects, capital grants, QR research grants, and also those things from HEFCE, and then obviously there's the the Research Council funding. You sign a single memorandum to get all that. If you were to go independent in the sense I think you mean by coming out of the charging 9,000 fee cap, etc., that's how the legislation works at the moment. If you're publicly funded for grants, you can't charge more than 9,000. So the model would be something like this. You separate the memorandum into two components, a research component and a teaching component, and institutions can decide whether they charge, whether they sign both, none, or one or the other. I think a lot of people are interested in that. For someone like Cambridge, where research is so important, there is, I think, much less chance of any independence until that change happens. And that change might well happen when OFS is established. It's much more interesting to look at someone like London School of Economics, which has no high-cost subjects, which gets most of its income from student fees, very high level of international fees. It would lose very little funding were it to leave on the current model. But it's always been a threat bubbling under. I mean, it was a live issue in 2010 when they were debating about the maximum tuition fee cap. Significant proportion of the Russell Group threatened to go independent at that point if the cap was too low, because if you remember, the Brown Review suggested no cap. So the 9,000 fee is, was a kind of compromise position. And this has been a serious issue that the Labour Party had to deal with when it was trying to put together that 6,000 fee cap. I explicitly discussed with their cameras on, isn't it? I discussed